Welcome everybody, I'm Brian, this is Above Board, and today we are joined by Cole Wehrle, designer of Root and Oath, among other games, and I'll leave it to him to introduce himself, so take it away, Cole.
Hi, thanks, Brian. So my name is Cole Wehrle. I am the creative director at Leader Games and the co-founder of Whirligig Games. I've designed games on lots of different historical subjects and also some fantasy games such as Root and Oath and lots of other things that we have in progress at Leader Games. I've been working professionally in the industry for almost 5 years now.
Great, excellent. So how did you get your start into design? Is it something you'd always wanted to do, or?
Well, it was a little bit of an accident, I think. I mean, I didn't really know that. I guess I knew people made board games, but I didn't really know that there was an industry of people making board games,
Right.
which is a little bit of a different thing. So when I went to school, I wanted to be a journalist, or I thought I did, and maybe work in radio or do some kind of long form journalism. And I had the kind of I had not a lot of luck, and I graduated. You know, I usually tell folks I graduated right after the Craigslist had killed all newspaper ad revenue, but before Facebook had created social media internships, right. So the social media correspondence. And so there weren't any journalism jobs. And so I found myself working at group homes. Then I went back to the university and I worked on a, I worked towards a professional degree, just doing research. I thought I was going to be a Victorianist and maybe I would teach at a university. But then I hitched my wagon to another dying industry as university jobs just collapsed around me. And so there weren't very many jobs for Victorianists. And during that time, I found myself working on games, mostly as a hobby, but also just as a kind of, it was a hobby, but it was also work. It was a kind of mental exercise where I would say, oh, I really wish that there was a game on this subject or that subject, and I wonder if I could just sort of think through what such a game might look like. As I was finishing my degree, I found myself realizing that the games that I had published, the early history games that I published in 2015, 16, 17, those games had gotten a much bigger response than any of the academic articles I ever worked on.
Right.
And as I was going through the final steps of my dissertation defense, I saw a posting for a job at Leader Games as a developer, and I just kind of threw my hat in the ring. And Patrick took a big risk and invited me up, and I packed my family in our little CRV, and we drove 1,500 miles north or so, and moved from Minnesota or from Texas through the Midwest and then back, and then to Minnesota, a place we'd never been. Right. When I started here, I threw myself wholeheartedly into this job. It pretty much took every waking moment for the first few years. And I've loved every minute of it. And I had been tinkering with games for a long time, but never with any desire to be published. That was never like a thing that I was really looking for. I was mostly just interested in the work. And it has gone from becoming work to a job to a career.
Okay. Well, it sounds like the risk certainly paid off. I mean, Root has become a massive success, and Oath has also been incredibly well received. Did that sort of success surprise you? The way it was received?
We had a playtest of Root when we had just finished the game. We had a playtest of Root right at the very end, where we were going to be submitting the files to the factory within a few days. And I did one more play in the office, and it was a weird game. It was the type of Root game that doesn't happen very often, where we were playing on the winter map. Someone was playing the scoundrel who has the power to like destroy a clearing from the map. And I think almost every favor card from the core deck had been played. So the map, like turn 6, it was this like apocalyptic wasteland where everything had been destroyed, and everybody had like 24 points, but no one could figure out how to get 6 more points to win the game.
Right.
And I loved the game. And and at the end of the game, I said, boy, I have no idea who's going to like this, but I'm really happy that we made it because I really like it. And then when we were at Gen Con that same year in 2018, I was walking around the hotel and seeing people playing it on the floor because Gen Con didn't used to have a lot of like tables for open gaming in those years.
Right.
And so there were just people playing Root on the floor. And I thought, how weird is this? Because there's always a breakout hit game every year. And it was just, I never thought it would be something I'd work on. That was never something I never tried to like make a hit.
Yeah.
I just try to make something that is resonating with me, and then maybe that lines up with where the current market is. So yeah, it was a huge surprise. I mean, the short answer is it was an absolutely massive surprise.
Right. Well, you must be very pleased with how it's gone, and obviously,
Oh yeah,
I watched an interview a couple of days ago, and you talked about Root and how it was meant to just be the game, and it was the 4 players,
yeah,
the 2 maps, or the map, and then but it's since gone on to have, well, we've started dozens of expansions and add-ons, and just this entire community kind of growing from this seed.
yeah, and it is one where I don't feel like I get to fully own Root. Root is, something that is owned fully by our company, but even our company, we feel like we are stewards of Root.
Yeah.
And we will continue to expand and grow that game as long as people want us to expand and grow it.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's a beautiful game, and I think the artwork has done a lot to sort of sell it as well, because it's not the sort of game people necessarily expect when they pick it up. I know it wasn't for me when I saw the artwork. It really appealed to me, and then I got home and sort of got into it, like, oh wow, this is a serious game. This has got some real bones to it. So
there's a lot going on underneath the hood, but that's we are one of the things about our brand identity. This is something, one of the very first meetings I had with Patrick when I first started working here was we were talking about company identity, and I kind of told him, like, look, it's one thing to be known as the company that makes asymmetric games, but what if we were known for making player-driven, emergent strategy games that really reward repeated play? And so I usually tell folks, when I sell our games at conventions and things, the type of titles that we produce are titles where, one, they're going to be very interactive and they're not scripted. Things can get weird in these games. And the second thing is they really reward repeated play.
Right.
And we've kind of carved a little niche out in the current industry of doing the sorts of games that really reward study. And that isn't to say that like our games, I think it's a weird thing to say, because it sounds like you're patting yourself, or I'm patting myself on the back when I say, it rewards study. When really what I'm saying is, when we optimize, it's just a different thing you can optimize for. Because when you're designing, you can optimize for someone's first experience. Like if you make a mistake, how quickly do you get feedback about the mistake that you've made? Do you have a chance to correct your score? Are you going to feel like you were in contention even if you weren't playing very well? And really good games can do those things, and really bad games could do those things, right? It doesn't make a game good or bad. And the kind of games that we work on, we kind of give ourselves a pass and say, let's just, as a given, say that no one is going to get this game until their 3rd game. Yeah. And then what does that open up? And that comes from, myself and a lot of people on staff, we play a lot of competitive video games. And when you sit down to play like a new MOBA or like a Dota or like play Starcraft, it's going to take hundreds of hours to develop any kind of mastery into that game.
Yeah.
And as soon as you make that bargain, that contract with the player, all sorts of different design tools open up that are not present if you're just trying to optimize for the single play.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned games like Starcraft, for instance, RTS games, especially asymmetric games. I think Starcraft was in fact one of the earlier iterations that gave us asymmetry. Up till then, it was been sort of just blue team versus red team.
Yeah.
Very mirror matched. So did that kind of influence your design decisions? Because Root could almost be
like a kind of an RTS. Yeah. Well, and in fact, after we had finished Root, somebody sent us this game called Tooth and Nail, which is also like an anthropomorphic animal RTS. It's actually really good. I wish I could say it was an influence of Root, but I encountered it later. Starcraft, I will say, there is no escaping from it. Is the short thing about Starcraft, because I've been playing Starcraft for, my goodness, I could almost say I've been playing it for all my life. I started playing Starcraft probably in 6th grade. Yeah. And I still play the Starcraft 2 regularly. And whenever I'm running into a design problem, I'll say, like, let's go to the whiteboard and talk about like what Starcraft teaches us about this design problem. So it informs like almost every element of my design practice.
That's really interesting to hear. Yeah, because I kind of wondered if there was sort of video game influences throughout a lot of your
Well,
designs, because
yeah, you like can't get a lot. This is true of a lot of board gamers. I mean, a lot of, especially folks of my generation, we're kind of reared. I think anybody born, after 1980 is in some degree like reared in video games, or even Gen Xers to a degree. And what I find really interesting is how people read video games and then apply the lessons from video games. So one of my biggest pet peeves actually about the work of other designers is I find sometimes there's an over literal application of the lessons from video games, where I'll play a Civ game and I'll say like, oh, you like love Sid Meier's Civilization and you really wish you could play it in analog format. And to me, that is the mainstream of thematic game design, is like stuck in that place where they're trying to recapture the feeling of playing a video game in the space of design.
Yeah.
And to me, there's this other way of engaging with it, which is to say, think about what a video game is teaching you about how a game works, either how it tells a story or the kind of incentives that that system presents. And then ask yourself, how do you apply those lessons to the problem that you're working on? And so, I think about, there's probably a handful of video games that are huge influences on my work, but they're not going to seem like, it's like I'm taking a mechanism from it, because it's going to be ham-fisted. If I tried to introduce like a worker rush into Oath, it'd be like silly, right? And so that is always something that I'm looking for. And I'm thinking about games, and these are good games in some respects, like something like Clash of Cultures or Through the Ages, as being so overtly patterned off of a Sid Meier's Civilization, which is a fine thing to pattern off of it. But I think it just isn't the sort of way that I think through design at all.
Yeah. Well, you've certainly got your own spin, your own twist on the genre, and it's interesting just that you mentioned the influence that video games have had on Root, and now we see it's gone full circle. Root has now become a video game, so
right, yeah.
sort of feed back into each other.
My children, I have 3 kids, and the older 2, who are 8 and 6, learned Root on the Switch. That was like I had it on our Switch, and they had known that it was a thing that I had worked on, and they wanted me to teach it them. And I said, yeah, of course, we'll play this weekend. And then they started playing it on the Switch and went through the Switch tutorials. And so we sat down to play Root, they already knew how to play because they'd been through the tutorials.
Awesome. So, and that brings, I guess, the next iteration was Oath, and a lot of things that you sort of influences that you had from Root. I can sort of see those feeding into Oath, but Oath I wrote a written review about it a few weeks ago, and I had a hard time kind of pinning down what kind of game is it, and I went with sort of open world building,
sure,
sort of
Oath is, I mean, my fastest way of explaining what sort of game Oath is Oath is a political game. It's a political roguelike. It's a political game built with the design philosophy of a roguelike, as if you were playing a game. Well, I'll use a video game reference, as if you were playing a Crusader Kings or hell, an RTS, but it were Spelunky or something, because you are doing these runs, and each run you're learning about the system, but you're also changing the system in subtle ways. It's a little bit like a Rogue Legacy type game. But the way that the cards are designed and how they interact with each other is very nonlinear. I mean, so Oath is essentially built around a really simple question, which is it possible to make a game where how a player wins is much more important than who wins? So to answer that question, you start saying, well, what if the end state of a game is also a viable start state? And that's the kind of statement that maybe doesn't say a lot to folks who just play games, but it's a very scary statement among folks who design them, because we know that games are little systems that produce a lot of entropy. And so something like a chess game, by the end of the chess game, there's like 4 pieces on the board, or maybe
Yes.
like 8, right? And so that's not a viable start state to anything because the engine is spending all of its energy.
Yeah.
And so we had to build Oath in such a way that that wouldn't happen, that the game could actually produce these new states. Now, Oath cheats a little bit because it has this cleanup phase, which kind of repairs the game state and prepares it for the next round. But so it like came from this like interesting mechanical problem, but also like a narrative problem I saw, which was that there are a lot of games about history, but history is often remembered and understood on the generational level. So like I think history is basically experienced 3 ways by people. And this is me, I'm maybe being a little philosophical, but we experience it as the present, where it's confusing and it's hard to know what anything's worth. So that's like a purely tactical and reactive framework, right? We might feel like history is happening, but it may not be. It's hard to know. We're in the present moment. And then we can experience history on a legendary lens. We can think about it like an epic tale.
Right.
And this is like how I access, I don't know, World War II or the Napoleonic period, where, well, the Duke of Wellington might as well be a dragon or something. He's a mythological figure. I have no like deep connection to him, and he means so much more than what he is in his own life as a human, maybe. And then there's this other way of experiencing it, which is actually the way that we most commonly experience history, which is on the generational scale, which is to say that like, you might have children and you certainly have parents and your parents have parents and those people, and people get married and fall in and out of love and have kids, and a building gets built and then gets torn down. And this is like history at the scale of 20 years.
Yeah.
And when you're working as a historian and you're trying to tell stories, you're mostly trying to either take the present. If you're writing a contemporary story, you're taking the present and you're trying to shift it to the generational. Let me give you the longer view. Queen Elizabeth just passed away, and the really interesting pieces about her life are trying to put her in the context of the 20th century. That's moving her from the moment we're in now, to this kind of generational scale. Or you're trying to go back to the legendary period and bring it into the generational scale. Let me tell you about the Duke of Wellington's parents or about his children, right? And so when I was thinking about games in history, it occurred to me that of course, there are many games about history, but so few of them actually operate on the generational scale. And I think board games are just really bad at it. So the quasi-legacy format of Oath was an attempt to operate in the time scale, which I think is an incredibly powerful storytelling, like narrative space to work in. And Oath kind of lives in it, but it makes Oath kind of a weird game. For the same reasons.
I think what I loved about Oath is the way you did capture that. You kind of got that legacy element in there, and that open worldness, and the fact that you can end state is the start state of the next game. It really does mirror real world politics. It's something that doesn't stop. It just goes from day to day to day throughout generations, and one generation will inherit the political system of the previous one, and then they'll have their influences on it and change it and mold it. And then that will go through, be inherited by the next generation who'll do the same. And that was sort of the feeling I got from Oath, is the end of the game is the end of one generation, and that system gets inherited by the next.
Yeah, and a lot of that was a reaction to me playing PAX games and thinking about the kinds of history telling that they do, and wanting to have the game contextualize itself. And so Oath actually there's a funny sort of like weird backstory to the game, which is that the earliest idea for Oath I had was thinking about how I was listening to players talk about Root when they weren't playing Root. And also I was finding myself talking about games that I had played that I wasn't actively playing. And I was thinking like, wow, the way I'm talking about this is a little bit like how a historian talks about their subject. There's like a little bit of a distance, like the critical discussion around a game, even if it's just a casual critical discussion, it's a little bit like the kind of analysis you do when you're doing history, or when you're doing any kind of scholarly pursuit. And so I started thinking like, is there a way I was starting to imagine the kinds of conversations I wanted people to have about their games of Oath. and then thought about, can I build a game for that to happen? And so one example was, so Oath, for instance, has this deck of cards. You only use the top half each game. So it's an incredibly low card count game for how big it is. Oftentimes in a game, you only see 20 cards, maybe 25. And that the reason why it's like that is because you have these 25 cards that are like the active game cards. And as you get deeper into the deck, it's harder for them to come out. And then you will have, so that means that you could have you can find a very powerful, interesting thing. And then it can go away and you could think that it was gone, that it had been lost to history. And then 4 games later, it can show up. And it can be the big reveal of I thought that magic was lost, but here it is. And it's actually completely changing what I think the last part of this game is going to be. And I thought about that, talking about a game and not being totally sure what the game was that you were all building together. There's the sense of the unknown in it, which is one of my favorite parts of Oath as an exploration game, which is why I think it's interesting to hear people talk about it as an open world game, because I think it's a very fair way of talking about it. Is the game itself is the unknown, and by playing and winning the game, you are making it known. And then as new players win and things get shuffled in, the game starts becoming kind of unknown. It kind of exists in this fuzzy state.
Excellent. It's quite a triumph of design, I think, and it's one I think I enjoyed even more than Root, just because of that legacy sort of esque nature and that ongoing evolution, as you say, and having things pop up much later down the track that you say you felt was lost to history, sort of almost rediscovering things. So now obviously you're working, or have just still working, I guess, on Arcs, which is the next one in the series, I suppose. If we, would you call it a series? I mean,
it's I feel it's so funny. I feel like all my design work that I've done is really in these 2 pursuits. I have this series of history games and then this series of fantasy games, but that's those are these are massive decades-long projects, the realization of these series. And I think I've got some other projects that don't quite fit in, but the fact that I'm sensing that they don't fit in suggests there is some affinity between these projects, because in some ways Oath is very much a reaction to Root and the things that Root could and couldn't do. And Arcs is very much a reaction to both Root and Oath. And Arcs is weird. Arcs is a weird game. So Arcs started as the earliest ideas of Arcs were, I liked, so Oath had this problem. It's not a problem, it's just an element to, so one way of thinking about design, this is actually the way I would say this properly. One way of thinking about design is that it's like you're building a bridge and you make decisions about the kind of materials you're going to use and where the bridge is going to be built. And then the bridge is going to look a certain way. Ultimately, there are choices that you're making, but usually when it comes to the final design, design often feels not like you're at a buffet, but at least for me, it feels like I'm not at a buffet. I feel like I'm getting backed into a corner. And so sometimes people are like, oh, this lovely thing that you came up with, how did you imagine that? And I'm like, I didn't imagine it. It was the only thing that worked. It was my last refuge. And so I think about Root's combat rolls are exactly that way, where I'm I know precisely the numbers I need the system to generate. I know that the combat needs to be resolved in one roll. I know there needs to be this interrupt. Okay, it's going to look like this, and then it kind of looks like that. So the downside to this approach in design is that sometimes, and this certainly happened with Oath, you make choices about what you want a game to be, and the game can only look a certain way. And so Oath, I knew I wanted the game to never end, but that meant that the game couldn't have these climaxes. It couldn't have these big moments. It couldn't be in important ways a storytelling game the way Root could sometimes tell stories. Oath is telling telling histories, but history can make for great narrative or bad narrative, right? I mean, it could go one way or the other. So with Arcs, I started thinking okay, if Oath was a love letter to the ways of understanding history, I want to make a game that is really about narrative and how storytelling works and where the storytelling beats are. And to put the game in line with a lot of like narrative theory that I'm really interested in. And so I just started thinking about the problem, not the problem, but thinking about using the legacy format in a non-open-ended way, but without pre-scripting everything. And so that then led me to the idea that like, okay, well, we have the 3-act structure. What if I made a game that played itself in 3 acts? Now I found this very appealing as a player because I don't have very much time. And I love the idea of campaign games, but when I see a campaign game that advertises like 40 hours of content, I'm like, I hate it. I can barely play a 10-hour video game. I will never play a 20-hour like board game. That's not going to happen. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just my personal taste. And so I started thinking like, well, what if we're building this emergent campaign game where the players are doing all of the scripting and writing as they're playing. So it has a lot of replayability out of the box. Maybe it should only take like 6 to 8 hours to play through. And if that's happening, then that's really 3 sessions. And so now I'm thinking about making a game that generates a story that tells itself in 3 parts. I thought, oh, well, this seems like kind of a compelling thing. And I then ran into an interesting puzzle, which was what if if you're telling the story with these really different parts, one of the problems is that if I am trying to like rescue refugees and you're trying to discover like an ancient secret, we're not interacting, which means we probably shouldn't be playing a board game at all.
Yeah,
we have no zone of interaction. So I was like, well, you need some kind of like media. We need like some kind of like fluid that can suspend all of our game states and provide interesting taut interaction, but in a way that doesn't allow us to like step on our toes too much, but we still feel like it's still creating good narrative drama. Yeah. And so that led me to creating this card-driven action system, which I used the kind of rough framework of trick-taking games. Yeah. I find it's very, very curious. Someone was like, oh, someone accused me the other day of like chasing a board game fad to make a trick-taking strategy game. And I was like, that's not really like what happened. Like what happened was I opened up like the back door into something that happens to be blowing up right now, because I was like, oh, like, I don't know, trick-taking games are really beautiful when it comes to their narrative beats, because it's fundamentally, it's like a very syncopated form. Like I'm going to be playing, and then I'm going to pass the lead to you, and you're going to play a little bit, and then I'm going to come play. And that's like a very beautiful, organic narrative framework. It's got some cinematic qualities to it. And so I started thinking about this. And then as I was stewing on it, Patrick was working on a space game that was having a little bit of trouble. And I just kind of asked him like, hey, if you don't want to make a space game, I would love to take all this work that I've done and turn it into a space game.
Right.
And he said, you know what, I'm happy to put my thing on the shelf. Why don't you go for it? And then ARCS emerged out of that format. And it's changed a lot since that first conception. But in critical ways, it is exactly the same as it's ever been. And I think it is both of the things I've done at Leader Games, by word count, it's by far the simplest.
Right.
But I think it is probably the most interesting design from a mechanical perspective. Like it just creates a lot of like really meaty, interesting puzzles, and it has very good fluid narrative flow. And so it feels like a little bit of a synthesis of some of my thinking, but it's really just a totally different game.
Right.
It's not going to fire Root or Oath.
It's definitely what I'm looking forward to. And I can certainly see even more of those StarCraft influences in there as well. It kind of has that sort of vibe to it. So it's sort of as an evolution, like you say, you're finding elements of your previous games that didn't work with one another, but were still really interesting mechanics or interesting themes and ideas, and you've sort of incorporated those now into ARCS, which I'm really excited to play. It looks like a game that's absolutely right up my alley. Where do you see ARCS going when you compare to your previous games?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, one thing that I want from ARCS is I think ARCS to me is sitting in this really interesting spot where it is Let me really think about that question, because arcs to me is it's sitting in a very interesting spot where what I'm trying to do with it is basically, I think that as a design, it stands really well alone. Like, it actually, you don't need to necessarily engage with all of the high content, like and all of the campaign materials and the things associated with the kind of full arcs experience to really enjoy arcs. And so what we've done, and we did this in the lead up to the Kickstarter, and I've been really happy that we did it actually, is we kind of broke arcs into 2 games. We said, look, here's arcs. Arcs is a $60 game. It's in a box the size of Root's box, and it's a very, very good 60 to 90 minute, maybe 120 minutes if it's a first game or something. Players are playing a little slow. Strategy game that, if you love an interesting, deep strategy game, you're going to just find a ton to enjoy. And then from there, if you look at something like Oath and you say, boy, Oath seems a little intense, but I really want to explore this kind of emergent chronicle style gaming, then the Arcs campaign expansion will like basically upgrade your arcs to be able to do that. Yeah. Or if you find yourself saying, I wish I liked these strategy games, but I wish it were a little bit more asymmetric and focus on those things, then like Root is obviously the place where you should go. So what we've seen among our audience is people kind of moving through the products in different ways. And so I wanted to use arcs, if possible, as a kind of doorway for folks, so that if they had never played any of our games, I could say, like, look, start with arcs, because if you find yourself compelled by it, you're going to like our other stuff, and the things that resonate with you in arcs are going to help guide you on that kind of exploration. And so, one of the big things I wanted, though, is I think Oath is when we were working. This is a weird way to say this, but I'll just kind of say it. When we were working on Oath, Oath is a game that we never really released at a convention because it came out during the pandemic. And so that means I never really had to sell it during a convention. And it does sell pretty well during the convention. It's sold great for us. We're really happy with how it's done. But Oath is not the kind of game that I'm ever going to see someone playing on a hotel floor.
Right. Yeah.
No one is going to buy Oath at the convention and say, woohoo, let's go back to our hotel lobby and like crack this game open and just like learn it. And people can do that with Root, but I think Root is actually a bit of a stretch. And so I really wanted to make a game that I could like hand to someone and say, like, I think I'm really proud of this game, and you can learn how to play it in 10 minutes.
Right.
And you will just so quickly see why I think it's so special. And so I really wanted to be able to do that with arcs. And as we were working on arcs, it was, people on the staff said, hey, we were basically testing a lot of arcs by using this single session format, which was basically just a cribbed version of the campaign format. And one of the staff members, one of our developers, said, like, hey, this single session format could be a really good standalone game. And in fact, I would love to be able to say, like, hey, day one of a convention, come buy arcs. If you love it, come back and pick up the campaign expansion on the last day of the convention and take that home with you. And I've been so happy with how it's gone. And like, arcs is a game that, of the games I've worked on, boy, I just love playing it. It is one that I find myself consistently encountering like really novel and interesting problems. And where I'm at right now in my life, I like don't really have like a good Oath group. And Root is a game that it's very funny how I play Root, where it's like I don't play Root at all unless I'm working on Root, and then I play a ton of Root.
Right.
So like once every 18 months, I'm going to spend 3 months of my life playing like 2 games of Root a day.
Yeah.
Which is great. I have no complaints. I really enjoy Root, and I'm super happy it has just continued to thrive. But Arcs is a game that, like, with my current game group, I would take a copy of Arcs to the weekly game night.
Yeah. So it has that level of approachability that perhaps the previous games didn't have, at least, in terms of learning the rules. Like you say, you can learn to play it in 10 minutes and set it up anywhere, and
sure,
you're good to go.
So, and it has a flow to it. It's just very percussive. And it, when we were prototyping it, I was really careful to prototype it physically primarily and not prototype it digitally, which puts you in contact with a very different base of players and a very different kind of feedback. And I did that because I fundamentally wanted this to be something that like leapt out of the box. It was like easy to set up, easy to play. Let's get right to the game right now.
And I think you've touched on one of the probably the biggest barriers to gameplay is just setup, getting it out of the box and just looking at. I have games on my shelf that I've had sitting here for a year. I've never opened, some even longer, and it's just so daunting. You open the box, see like 4 rule books and a ton of components, and it's just like, not today. And it goes back on the shelf for another 6 months.
Yeah.
So it sounds like with Arcs, you've kind of definitely solved that problem where it's just like, let's just get it set up and get to work.
Yeah. And there are, I mean, it's funny the games that hit us, right? We were talking about this actually recently, how a lot of the games that I like really love, I could teach them today, not having played them for years, because there was like a kind of clarity to their organization. And I love the work that we've done at Leader, but a lot of the games we've worked on, they're a little bit more demanding. And that's fine. There's a lot to be gained from a demanding game, but it's a little harder to sort of jump back in. And with Arcs, I very much wanted to say like, boy, I love a good, clean strategy game. Can I try to build one of those? And Arcs is kind of my attempt to build one of those.
Have you ever looked at the design of Arcs and like, okay, here's a game that we've made that's really accessible but really meaty and crunchy? Would you ever go back to a game like Root or Oath and make like a Root Light or Oath Light?
Yeah, I mean, well, so Root's really interesting because I think we because we're constantly getting new players, we can't really revise it because there are too many players being added constantly. It's like it'd be it's sort of like trying to build a boat while also like jetting around. And so what we do then is we have a project like Ahoy, which we're publishing later this year, which is releasing later this year. It's already printed, it's on the water. And Ahoy is, you know, I describe it as like it's a route you can like take home to your parents.
Right.
It's just a little bit more approachable. It's a little lighter. Doesn't have like the depth and the replay. I mean, it has a ton of replayability actually. It's quite a deep game, but it isn't, you know, it's not like a lifestyle game the way Root can sometimes be like a lifestyle game. And what I love about Ahoy is that it's a pretty deep game that is like easy to teach. And also it's $40. And so we were able to say, because a lot of people would look at Root and say like, oh my gosh, there's so much Root. There's all these expansions. And Ahoy, what we liked about it is we really tried hard to get the price point at $40 because we wanted people to say, okay, yeah, like I'm going to encounter this casually at a game store and I've never played a Leader Games game. Maybe I'll take a chance on it. It's like, yeah, you should. I mean, that's exactly the kind of player we want to play Ahoy. So yeah, I don't really have a pressing desire to go back and revise things. I do want to do an Oath expansion that isn't exactly like Oath 2.0, but the way the expansion is kind of constructing itself in my mind right now does allow the system to kind of like update itself in kind of some neat ways. And I'm very excited about that project, but it's waiting until after Arcs is done.
Fantastic. I look forward to that. I'm looking forward to getting my hands on Ahoy at some stage as well when it's released.
Yeah, soon.
Yeah, it'll be great. It takes a little bit longer for things to come down to New Zealand, but hopefully it won't be too far away.
Sure. Yeah, I think, I mean, it's one of the, I don't know where it is in the Australia, New Zealand zone, but it's on its way. We've gotten a lot better at like doing quasi simultaneous releases where things might only be offset by 2 months from the first person to get it to the last, as opposed to like 5 or 6 months, which is how it used to be a few years ago.
And I guess that brings us to sort of the next point I wanted to bring up today, and it's around some of the challenges that the industry have faced, and you know, would have encountered over the last couple of years for a little thing called the pandemic.
Yep, heard about it.
Yeah, got that over there too. So yeah, just I guess some of the challenges that, like, we're kind of living in the semi post-COVID era. I mean, it's still there. It's going to be around for a while. But I think we're kind of adapting life around it a bit better than we were at the beginning. But certainly, how has that affected how you design or publish games?
Well, I mean, it's dramatically changed how we make them. It hasn't, you know, I will say business has been very good, and COVID for many board game producers has been a time of expansion, especially those with really good, solid fan bases that like play a lot of online games already. So I think, you know, if you look at the size of our business before COVID and after COVID, COVID was a season of growth. A lot of people stayed home and played board games, and we were happy to work on them. But it did really dramatically change how we develop our games. And the biggest change is that I'll say corrected. It corrected a investment imbalance in playtesters and publishers. So here's what I mean when I say that. If you're playtesting a game for a publisher, the playtester, the publisher says, hey, here's the new version. This is version B. And you as the playtester, you have to go to a copy shop, or maybe you go to work or use your home printer. You have to print out everything. You need to study up on the new rules changes. You have to glue tokens. You have to update your personal kit. You have to throw away the other kit. And then you have to find players, and you got to get them together on a Friday night, and maybe you get lucky. And so, you know, that means I'm releasing a kit on Monday morning, and I'm praying so hard that people will get their kits updated by the end of the week, so that I can catch a few weekend play tests to play with groups. And of course, I'm only playing, the only groups who are playing are groups where the group is dominated by people who want to play test. So if you have a group where one person wants to play test and the other 3 people don't, then the play test doesn't happen. And when the pandemic first happened, it atomized all the gaming groups. And that means that if you're a free radical, if you're like a little floating electron without a home, and you really want to play test, but now you don't need to worry about that one person in your group who doesn't want to play test, well, you can go find the other people who want to play test. Exactly. And so suddenly we had access to all these amazing play testers who I didn't have access before, because they had people who didn't want to play test in their lives. Right. And then we switched to digital prototyping. And that changed so much, because now I release a kit on Tabletop Simulator or any other platform, and as soon as that kit is out, everyone has the kit instantly. And that means that the work of preparing the kit is a lot harder for me, because I have to manage everything. But I'm removing that work, and I'm one person doing the work, or maybe, you know, our team is doing the work rather than every single group doing the work. So the friction on releases is on me. And so, you know, I'll give you 2 examples of how this changed our workflow. Now I'm releasing kits on Thursday or Friday, early on Friday, because I want someone to say, hey, here are the patch notes, go play the kit. And everyone gets very excited, and they start forming games, and they're playing. And in fact, we found it doesn't even matter when you release the kit, because people weren't doing anything. They were staying at home, and they were doing a lot. And it was hard. I don't want to trivialize like the awful period that we've gone through, but for many of our testers, they were at home trying to find things to do. I mean, this is a lot of times the people who were most affected by the pandemic. I mean, many of them were like folks in the service industry, and a lot of the people in our testing groups were like white collar workers. And I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but they were folks who were able to easily transition to work from home, and who suddenly had time commuting that now they could use to play board games. This did something very weird to our playtesting. I used to have to make these kind of like big relay race charts, and they would say like, okay, these are my wave A playtesters. I know that the attrition rate is 60, 70, 80%. So by the time we get to wave B, I have this new injection of playtesters, then they're going to exhaust. And then wave C, these playtesters are going to exhaust. And I would have certain groups that I knew were very good at the beginning of a project. Other groups I knew were very good at the end of a project. They like playing something that's almost done, and they just want to like tighten screws here and there. And what we found was, with the switch to digital playtesting, is that went away, because actually what happened is, if people were enjoying the game, they were inviting their friends to our playtesting discords, which means that the playtesting group, they weren't having attrition. They were actually just generating organic growth. Right. So the Oath testing Discord, I think, started with like 30 or 40 people on it. By the end of the Oath's development, there were like 140, 150 people on that Discord. And there was a book club and a music club, and people were hanging out there. And it was like a place, and there's a whole community kind of sprang up around the work of that game. What's been interesting is, even as we've moved into this like quasi post-pandemic phase, which again, I say also with many reservations, that has largely remained intact. And in fact, only on ARCs and Ahoy, only on our most recent projects have I started seeing the old playtesting patterns starting to return. Right. Which makes sense. You would expect, that pattern wasn't there by an accident. I would expect it to kind of slowly reassert itself. And so I'm finding myself like reducing the number of version pushes that I do so I don't have too much attrition, building my playtesters into waves. But the general mode of doing all the testing digitally, I think that is here to stay for the long haul. So in the case of ARCs, I have physical kits and I've been working in the office, but now once the design really started stabilizing in terms of like the turn flow, I moved everything digitally because I can work much faster and I can just take the burden off the playtesters' backs.
Yeah, I think you've touched on a really important point of some of the positives that have come out of that situation. Like it's certainly been a boom for the board game industry in terms of, like you say, people been stuck at home a long time, looking for ways to stay sane, and board games have been there for them, and have been accessible and reasonably inexpensive, unless you really need. So that's a really interesting point you make, that, and I didn't think about the playtesting side. So and how that must have been a benefit to you guys in that way. So that's excellent. What about things like shipping delays or actual production, actually getting these things made to ship? Have there been any challenges around that?
Oh, so many. I mean, Ahoy, when we worked on Root, the very first printing of Root, I finished that game in March. I think it was like we submitted the last few files sometime in very early March. And we had that game at Gen Con that year.
Right.
So we had fulfilled the Kickstarter in July, and then we put the stuff in trucks and we sold it at Gen Con in August. For comparison, Ahoy was finished in January, even earlier, sort of, but there are complications. Was generally finished by January. And we had to air freight a few for Gen Con. And we are still waiting on the dang boat now, and it's September. And so we are looking at basically across the board, everything takes twice as long.
Yeah.
Just everything takes twice. It takes twice as long to get across the ocean, twice as long to get it produced in China, twice as long to wait for a factory slot. And at the scale which we operate, this is not ruinous, but it's a little frustrating because I'll use ARCs as an example. I would love to be able to be ahead of schedule on ARCs and to have it in everyone's hand by like summer of next year. And if we were in a pre-pandemic world, that would be possible. And it's just not possible at all in the world we live in, right? Where I feel comfortable about our current Kickstarter schedule. Maybe there'll be a little delay. It's not a big deal. But everything is slower. And we had, it's just so easy for us to have stock that we know would sell, but is tied up because it's sitting on a boat or it's in a port or we're waiting for factory priority or something like that. And so it has really affected our business. But what we've tried to do basically is say, let's just keep making a few really good games a year. Because the publishers who got hurt the most by this are the publishers who do lighter games or who churn through a lot of titles. Because if your whole business model depends on you moving something across the ocean 12 times a year rather than 3 times a year, then we're only dealing with the delays 3 times and someone else might be dealing with them 12 times. So we've tried to adjust our business model a little bit to insulate ourselves from some of the adjustments. And we've done things like explore production in other zones, but not seriously yet, because as frustrating as the time delays are, the price differentials are so high that it's still worth it.
Right. So have there been any sort of changes to your processes that you feel you wouldn't have developed had it not been for the issues you'd faced? And are you going to be carrying those on after this all sort of dies down and as things gradually begin to open up and return to some level of normalcy? Do you think those processes will carry on?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally I'll say that in terms of the operations processes, we're not really going to be changing our strategy going forward. The general, and that's because our particular corner of the industry wasn't overly affected by the pandemic. I mean, it was affected a little bit, but not in ways that that point to some kind of like systematic or essential failure on our part. And so, we have the biggest changes are on the dev side, and on the dev side, basically, COVID allowed us to learn so much about our processes and how we actually go about making these games. And in that respect, our processes today are permanently altered by the experience of living through that pandemic. And I think that those lessons are going to be held for a long time to come. And generally, I'll say that it changed our process for the better. No game that I've ever made has had as much development as Oath or the second edition of John Company. And both of those games were built by an extremely dedicated core of online testers who were able to work basically in real time with me and build those games the way like a video game gets built, just extremely fast iterative loop, tons and tons and tons of testing. And I think they're the most robust designs that we've worked on. And as we look at future designs, basically we want to make sure that we can plug the work that we're doing kind of in the real space that we inhabit into those procedures.
Right. Well, I think that's probably a good place to wrap that up. But thank you so much, Cole, for your time today. I'm aware that your time is sort of pressing on here. So
yes,
just really thank you for joining us today and sharing all your thoughts around games past, present, and future. And it's been really great to get your insights. So thanks so much for joining us. And for everybody watching, thank you for tuning in. And be on the lookout for that article coming up to Above Board's website in the future. So thanks so much.
Excited to take a look at it. Thank you very much, Brian, for having me on. It was it's lovely to reflect on the past couple of years and think about how much has changed and how much hasn't.
Fantastic. Thanks so much.
All right. Take care.
Bye.